Thank you, Shane. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Jewry, for that introduction. And thank you, Amani, for putting us in the right frame of mind to understand the context. So, it's absolutely ridiculous for anyone to claim that, Israel is white as the driven snow and all Israel is good. But at the same time, it's also almost equally ridiculous to claim that, Israel is equally split down the middle, and there's a good Israel and there's a bad Israel, and there's a war being waged for the soul of Israel that's 50-50, and Benjamin Netanyahu is the bad Israel. But if only he could be replaced by liberal Yair Lapid, then it would be the good Israel would return to us, and that's, of course, absolutely preposterous. Both these men sat together in the same government, perpetrated the same policies. For us to understand the Israeli political system, admittedly, it's difficult if you're coming in from the outside and you don't speak Hebrew, because there's dozens of parties that run for the Israeli parliament, and a dozen or more actually get in to the Knesset. So I've taken the time to analyze the actual statistics, meaning election after election for the last 20 years, 2 decades of elections. And I've broken down the Israeli political parties into camps. And in fact, Jewish political thought can be understood to be divided into several camps, and I'll break them down for you. How are these camps understood? The question we ask is, how do you see the Torah, the Talmud, the Jewish religious texts? Is the Torah holy? Was the Torah authored by Yahweh, by Jehovah, by God? And is the Torah just? When the Torah says that Jehovah, God gave this land to the Jewish people, that they are his chosen people and this land belongs to them, is that just? Is that fair? Is the Torah holy, and is the Torah just? So each of the camps responds to these questions differently. First, we have traditionally what I call the supremacist camp, the traditional Orthodox camp, and they would say yes, yes to both of these questions. Yes, the Torah is holy, it's written by God, and yes, it's just. The Jewish people are the chosen people, and this land is ours. Okay. The next camp I would call the reformist camp. They would answer differently. They would say yes and no. Yes, the Torah is holy. It's our religious tradition, and we hold fast to it, but no, it's not just. We're not comfortable saying we are better than others. We're going to try to change it and amend it and in such a way bring it in line with our modern liberal values. So that's the reformist camp. The next camp, I call it the opportunist camp, or the modern Zionist, the nationalist camp. And the opportunists, they have the opposite. They would say to these two questions, no and yes. Is the Torah written by God? No, of course not. It was written by people and then edited by other people over different periods of time. And it's literature. It's our national literature, just like Shakespeare is the national literature of the British people, but it's not written by Yahweh. But is it just that it says that we are the chosen people and this land is given to us? Yes. Yes, it is just. So, quick summary. No, there is no God. Yes, God gave us this land. So they don't even believe in it. So they're the opportunist camp. And then there's the fourth camp. I'd call it the humanist camp. And they say no and no to these questions. No, the Torah is not holy. It was just written by people. It's literature. And no, it's not just to say that we are chosen by God and that this land belongs to us more than any other people. So those are the 4 camps. Now, okay, another way of looking at it, is to, besides asking how they relate to the Torah, we can say, how do these 4 camps relate to the indigenous people of Palestine? How do these camps relate to the non-Jews around us? And in that case, we have a different set of titles, but they represent the same 4 camps. So this is what I mean. We have the integration camp, and they want a one state from the river to the sea, but for that state to be a democracy where everyone has equal rights. We have the separation camp that wants 2 states, one for Jews, and one for Arabs, for Palestinians. We have the domination camp that wants one state from the river to the sea, but for that to be an apartheid state, for Jews to have more rights than non-Jews. And then we have the elimination camp that wants to ethnically cleanse the country of non-Jews. Okay, so we've got this four-side schema, whether we talk about how it relates to the non-Jews amongst us, or whether it talks about how it relates to the Torah texts. We could also use different terms, just modern political analysis. Socialists, liberals, nationalists, theocrats. Whichever terms you use, we're talking about the same four camps, and this is how it plays out in the Israeli Knesset. I should also add that because Israel is the nationalist project to create a Jewish nation, a state in Palestine, therefore it's obviously the nationalist camp is actually the biggest camp in Israel amongst Jewish voters. And because of that, we can even, for argument's sake, break it down into two camps. We can say labor Zionist and revisionist Zionist, or left and right, but they're all Zionists, they're all nationalists. And when we look at the Israeli parliament and we analyze, like I said, 2 decades worth of elections to the Knesset, if we judge them by how each of these parties performed, it could throw us off. There's like, how do I supposed to make heads or tails of this? The fortunes go up and down. I can't make much sense of it. But if we take each of these parties and we funnel them into those camps, as I said, each of them is representing one of these political camps. Once we do that, all of a sudden our analysis of the exact same election becomes extremely static. Sure, there are some differences from election to election, but it's almost the same. Consistently, the domination camp performs the best. It's the largest sector of the parliament, 60% or so of the Israeli electorate. That's the largest camp. The second largest camp being the elimination camp, wanting to ethnically cleanse the country. Those are the 2 largest camps in the country, and this is the way it is year after year, election after election. We can map them all onto the other. We can, from left to right, we can see what the Israeli political spectrum looks like again and again. And when we apply that to the Israeli Knesset itself, 120 seats, we see that this is what the government looks like. All right? Now, the parties that are slightly light are the parties that are actually holding the government. You have to have 50% to control the government. And so we see, we're going back now to the end of the 2010s, and we have Netanyahu in power for that entire decade. And during that decade, his camp obviously is in the right-wing nationalist camp, and he had the religious camp in his government, and they were able to block off 50. Now, what changed? What happened recently that all of a sudden cracked this code, that caused us to see things in a different light? Well, of course, you may have heard Netanyahu has been up on major corruption charges. He's in the court right now, battling for his political future, but once these charges became public, it became very embarrassing, and as such, some of his closest allies started to peel away from him. And so, once that happened, he no longer had a majority, and things started to titter. We had election after election after election, one after the other in rapid succession, and finally, even one of the religious parties, the eliminationist parties, left him and withdrew their support. And because of that, and because they now are part of the opposite, because they are creating a government without Netanyahu, we have a situation where they're the most important. They are the wedge. They are the pivotal party that holds the balance of power. And as such, they were able to demand the position of prime minister. So now we have, for the first time in Israeli history, an eliminationist prime minister. That's the first difference that we see in the new Israeli government. And just so we don't get mixed up again and think that this is going to be somehow a better alternative, he openly stated, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, when he was elected, that this new government, his government, would be 10 degrees more right-wing than the Netanyahu government. So that's where we are today. And the second major change that came out of that recent election a year ago was the introduction of a new camp. Now, what's this new camp that came back into the Knesset for the first time in 33 years? We haven't seen it since. So we're talking about a fifth camp that I call the messianist camp, or the monarchist camp. And what is this camp? Well, in a sense, it's a combination of the nationalists and the theocrats. It's kind of like a bastard child of these two. It has the worst aspects of both without any of the release valves. So let's look at the first two for a moment. The nationalist camp. Now, both of these are right-wing camps. They're all right-wing camps, but the nationalists, although, yes, they are the military force that committed the Nakba and that implemented the depopulation of the country of Palestinians in 1948 and continued to oppress Palestinians, but at least they're secular Zionists. So you can have a conversation with them on a rational basis, for good or for bad. Okay, that's their release valve. Then let's look at the theocratic camp. Their vision isn't about being the lords of the land. It's about kicking out all the non-Jews. It's a psychotic vision. It's frightening, but what's their release valve? They are pacifists. Traditionally, the ultra-Orthodox community, although their vision for the country is, eliminationist, but they believe that it is not for them to bring that into being. It's for God to do. God is the one who's supposed to bring that future vision into practice. It's not for them. And so therefore, that's their release valve, that they're not implementing it in practice. But when we have the monarchist camp that takes the worst aspects of both, they believe in this eliminationist vision, and they believe in implementing it themselves. And that's why they're so dangerous. And the man that really, what they want is not just elimination, they want extermination. And they want expansion, if you can imagine this, not just to the West Bank and Gaza. They want to conquer Lebanon, and they want to conquer Jordan and Syria and Turkey and Iraq and Iran, and who knows how far. That's the messianist camp in Israel, and that's who just entered the Knesset. So to understand the history of the messianist camp, as I mentioned, it had first been in the Knesset 33 years ago, right? In the 1980s. So let's understand its origins. The man who was the biggest proponent of this camp, the man who I guess the founding father of Israel's modern messianist camp is Meir Kahane, an American-born rabbi, came up in New York City. And it's not difficult to understand his vision for the country. He made it very clear in his magnum opus, The Jewish Idea. It's many, many volumes long. I won't bore you with the text. It's a lot easier to just look at another book that he wrote, They Must Go. It's pretty in your face there. There's no beating around the bush, what he wants to happen. But here's just a couple choice quotes that he's made over the years so you can understand in his own words what he wants. Meir Kahane. When I'm prime minister, no Arab will be hurt by Jewish terrorism because there won't be an Arab left in Israel. I want to remove the Arabs from Israel because I do not want to kill them every week. They will come to me, bow to me, lick my feet, and I will be merciful and will allow them to leave. Whoever does not leave will be slaughtered. So this is Kahane. This is his vision. And his vision has inspired, sickeningly, no small amount of people to adopt his ideas on the streets of Israel, as you can see. Now, the Kahane movement, the Messianist movement, it's a horrible development, but it's most dangerous at exactly those moments when there's an opportunity for Israel to turn off the path of apartheid. Just when there's an opportunity to rein back the horrors, that's when they're most dangerous, because that's when they do their utmost to prevent that development. And so we see that in the late 70s, the early 80s, when Egypt and Israel signed a peace accord, Camp David Accords, and buried the hatchet. And if they wanted to prevent that from happening, the Kahane movement. And so Kahane himself actually plotted to blow up the Dome of the Rock, this Muslim shrine in the heart of East Jerusalem. This is like the third holiest shrine in Islam, the Al-Aqsa compound. And he sat in jail for 6 months for this attempt to blow up the mosques there. But would you believe it, just a few years after that, he was actually elected to the Knesset. So his views proved popular. Now, things were different back then, I have to say. In the mid-80s, when Kahane was elected to the Knesset, it was a different time in Israeli history. So he would get up to the podium and he would speak in front of the Knesset plenum. And when he did so, if you can believe this, members of the Knesset would walk out in disgust. Even members of the Likud party, the ruling Likud party, the right-wing Zionists, the revisionist Zionists, even they would walk out in disgust. But that was then, and this is now. Eventually, the Knesset did stand up to him and did pass a law that made it impossible for him to get re-elected to the Knesset, saying if you openly preach racial hatred, then you are ineligible for running for the Knesset. And as such, in the next elections, he wasn't able to run. So that was really the end of his political career. But that didn't stop the Kahane movement. A few years later, we have Kahane's acolyte, another Brooklyn-born Jewish American who moved to Israel following Kahane, Baruch Goldstein. Again, same idea, trying to prevent even the possibility of peace. So in the early 90s, when a labor nationalist, a left-wing nationalist, left-wing Zionist member of the Knesset, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, attempted to create the Oslo Accords to make a peace deal with the PLO and Yasser Arafat. Again, that's when the Kahane movement, that's when the messianists are most dangerous. And in order to try to prevent that from happening and to create a war of civilizations between Jews and 1 billion Muslims around the world and prevent the possibility of any peace deal, Goldstein walked in, again, to the holiest places for Jews and Muslims, this time not in Jerusalem, but in Khalil, in Hebron, in the southern West Bank. And he walked into the Cave of the Patriarchs, the shrine where, according to legend, the patriarchs, Abraham and such, are buried. And he walked in and he mowed down, it was the biggest mass murder in Israeli history, 29 Palestinians he killed and over 100 wounded. Of course, Goldstein was just one of many Kahanist killers over the years. He did have the biggest death toll on his hands, but again, what's more is the larger effect that he was able to impact upon. So because his mass murder was so heinous, it actually triggered the Hamas suicide bombings that we saw exactly 40 days after the mass murder he committed. That's the 40 days, the traditional Muslim mourning period, Arba'in. 40 days later, that's when the very first Hamas suicide bombing attack took place in Israel, and a whole series of them began. And of course, once that happened, Israelis wouldn't even think of a peace deal and couldn't contemplate it. And so Baruch Goldstein essentially buried the peace deal. He succeeded where Kahane had failed. And that's where we are essentially today in terms of no advancement, no possibility of peace since 1994. So those are the Israeli political camps, and that's just the grounding that we're going to use to now begin the presentation, just to bring us all on the same page. Okay, so up until now, I've been talking about the Kahane movement in Israel. But Israel, true, many of the world's Jews now live in Israel, but a majority of the world's Jews live outside of Israel, and a plurality of the world's Jews live right here in the United States of America, where Kahane was born, where Kahane was raised, where Kahane built his political following. And so it's mandatory that we look right here at the United States and understand how his movement has been impacted and has impacted upon the United States and US Jewry. So looking at the United States, we see that Jews amount to a very small percentage of the population, only maybe 2% of US citizens. In New York State, however, they are a much larger percentage, maybe 2 million out of 19.5 million. And in New York City itself, we're talking about maybe 1.1 million citizens out of 8.5 million. So we're already talking about a relatively large voting bloc that has an impact upon local politics. And if we look at the elections for president, for governor, and for mayor of New York, we see that, if we look and compare and contrast, we see that in New York, the voting trends swerve more to the left. Does that mean that Jews contributed to that? Well, in terms of their senators, it's even more the case that they vote for Democrats than Republicans. And the way to most easily see that is to look at all the presidential elections for the last century. Looking at all presidential elections going back to 1920, we see that in every single one of them, Jews voted for the Democratic Party candidate at a much higher rate than the national population in every single instance. All right? Here, the blue star is supposed to indicate the percentage. Okay? If each of the bars shows the percentage of Republican voters in dark blue and the Democratic voters in light blue, so the light blue Star of David shows how much further in percentage points the Jewish vote is over the national vote for the Democratic Party candidate. So clearly, there is a Jewish bump. There is a Jewish bump for the Democratic Party. The only election when that didn't happen was in 1920, when less Jews voted than for the Democratic Party candidate than the national election, but that's because more Jews voted for the Socialist Party candidate, Eugene Debs. In every other instance, it was the Democrat, and so yes, clearly there is a Jewish bump, a liberal voting bloc. Now, okay, when we go and we zoom in to New York City to try to get a clearer analysis of what this might mean for local politics, okay, admittedly, New York politics are affected not only, by global politics. It's a super multicultural metropolitan area, and so it's a very common refrain amongst politicians in that part of the world to say, if you want to get elected in New York, you have to consider the 3 I's. What are the 3 I's? Italy, Ireland, and Israel. You have to think of those 3 communities, or when you're running for election in New York City. Well, how does this play out on the ground? Where are we today? Looking at the mayor of New York City, just recently elected, Democratic Party Mayor Eric Adams. These are some of his most recent statements on the eve of his election, saying, "I visited Israel twice. I'm going back again. I love the people of Israel. The food, the culture, the dance, everything about Israel. I'm going to find a plot of land so it can be my retirement place in the Golan Heights." If you can imagine this, we have, in order to get elected, the mayor of New York City saying, I'm going to move, as soon as I'm finishing my term as mayor, I'm going to move to occupied territories and be a settler myself. This is how far gone we are, and this is the Democratic Party mayor. Of course, once we get to the Republican Party, it's just completely off the rails in this day and time. Talking about some of the quotes Donald Trump has made in recent years, saying, it used to be that Israel had absolute power over Congress, okay? But he's not complaining, he's wishing that this could be the truth. Israel literally owned Congress. Israel had such power, and rightfully over Congress. He wants that to be the case. It's bizarre. Now, of course, it's not so far-fetched, because his 2 closest advisors on Middle Eastern issues, his ambassador to Israel and his advisor for Middle East issues, Jared Kushner and David Friedman, these men were both contributors to the Kahane cause. They had both contributed of their own money to an organization headed by Dov Lior, the Kahanist rabbi, who said about Baruch Goldstein, the biggest mass murderer in Israeli history, Baruch Goldstein is holier than all the martyrs of the Holocaust. This is who they contribute to. This is who had Trump's ear all these years. So yeah, that's how far gone it is. But it gets even crazier. Trump goes on to say, Jewish people who live in the USA don't love Israel enough. Complaining that this is just off the wall. Then he goes on to say, any Jewish people that vote for a Democrat, it shows great disloyalty. But I'm not talking about Orthodox Jews. Okay, so now we're going deeper. We're realizing, as I said, that the Jewish community is not a monolith. There's a spectrum, just like in every society, there's a spectrum of political opinion amongst Jews and amongst Jewish Americans. So what's he getting at here? Now, he's pointing out a fact that the majority of American Jews who are secular, who are not Orthodox, are against Israel's occupation in Palestine, are against apartheid, of course, it's true what he says, that most Orthodox Jews are supporting Trump. That is true, okay? But that's only 9% of the Jewish population in America, okay? But to him, those are the only good Jews. 91% of Jews are bad Jews. This is the reality that he wants us to imbibe. So, yeah, this is the reality on the ground. 71% of American Jews vote for the Democrats consistently, and on the flip side, 77% of Orthodox Jews vote Republican. So clearly there is a disparity, there's a cleavage, there is a vast difference within the Jewish community. And this is what I'm getting at. This is where we have to look long and hard. Now, please don't get me wrong. I do not mean to say in any way, shape, or form that, again, just as the Jewish community is not a monolith, also the Orthodox community is not a monolith. It doesn't mean that every Orthodox person is right-wing racist and no. Just as one quick example to bust that bubble, yes, there's people like Senator Rappaport who stood in solidarity when Trump announced his Muslim ban, not allowing Muslims into the country, stood in solidarity. This is a man who started up a soup kitchen, an incredible project in New York City, that a soup kitchen that looked like a regular restaurant in every way, shape, and form, that served people with dignity, good quality food, healthy food, and served them with in a way with napkins and tablecloths in a way that made them feel equivalent to anyone else regardless of their income. And so, much respect. And of course, these soup kitchens were not only open to just for Jews, they were for the entire community of New York. But unfortunately, Senator Rappaport is the exception to the rule. He's the exception that proves the rule. And sadly, we now have to look at the rule, the common denominator here. Talking about Orthodox Jews in America being a voting bloc for the right-wing Republicans, but that was not always the case. This is a relatively new development, it must be said. We need to look back and look at history, and going back to just a few decades, if you can imagine this, here is the district attorney of Brooklyn, all right? Edward Silver was the president of Young Israel. This is probably the largest organization of Orthodox synagogues in America. Certainly the earliest amalgamation of Orthodox synagogues. Started out in New York City, since branched out to the rest of the US and other parts of the world. And he was its president. And at the same time as he was, and he wasn't just district attorney, he was district attorney of Brooklyn, elected on the Democratic ticket. Okay, so even just a few decades ago, Orthodox Jews did vote in numbers for the Democratic Party. What changed? What happened? Well, 1967. Israel now spreads in every direction, conquers territories, east, west, north, south, and the conquest of the holy places, including the Al-Aqsa, the Haram al-Sharif, and the Dome of the Rock, it filled Theocratic Jews with the idea that they could now be in the Messianic age, that they don't have to wait any longer for God to come down and rid the country of non-Jews, that they could do it themselves, that we were in a Messianic era. And so, yes, in Israel that played out the way it played out, and here in the United States, the following year, we saw that Meir Kahane, this is the same Meir Kahane, beginning his political career, establishing the Jewish Defense League in New York City. This is the beginning of the Messianic movement right here in the US, and the beginning of the transition. Now, of course, as I explained, Kahane then moves to Israel and launches this political career there with his the Kach party. But back in New York City, he spawned a dozen terrorists that went on to terrorize New York City and other American cities, bombing boats, bombing banks, bombing bookstores, not just causing physical damage, wounding people, killing people. Out and out terrorists. In the mid-1980s, the FBI declared them to be the #1 domestic terrorist threat, Jewish supremacists. So, of course, they attacked UN buildings, they attacked over a dozen consulates and embassies. in the United States. And once Kahane moves to Israel, he inspires over a dozen of these terrorists to move with him, American-born Jewish terrorists, move with him to Israel and launch terrorist careers in Israel. He launches, his words become so inspiring in Israel that he inspires over a dozen Kahanist killers. But it's not enough. He was hoping that he could sweep up larger chunks of the population. Yes, the Kahanists have killed dozens of people, mostly Palestinians, in recent decades. They are certainly the most racist and most murderous Jewish political group to emerge in the last half century. But it wasn't enough for Kahane. It wasn't coming fast enough. It wasn't scaring Palestinians into fleeing the country at the rate that he'd hoped. So the Kahane movement needed another way to achieve the same goal, albeit at a slower pace, but in a determined fashion. So to do that, he recruited his younger brother. This is Kahane and his parents and his younger brother, Nachman, also born and raised in New York City. Nachman also, just as Kahane was a rabbi of the Young Israel movement, Nachman also was a rabbi of the Young Israel movement in New York. He moved to Israel and following his brother, or actually even before his brother, and established the Young Israel synagogue in East Jerusalem. And he established the Kahanist vehicle for dispossessing Palestinians on the ground in East Jerusalem, called Ateret Kohanim. So what's Ateret Kohanim? What do they do? Their objective is to, as I said, ethnically cleanse Jerusalem of non-Jews. And the way that they do this is by getting donations from Kahanist millionaires here in the US, and then by funneling those funds to Israel and then purchasing properties in the old city, in the Muslim quarter, so that they can one by one, piece by piece, take over an Arab area and de-Arabify it, and Judaize it, property by property. And so they'll take over a property, they'll find some Palestinian person who's in economic straits, and they'll offer them an obscene amount of money, and they'll get the property, and of course, once it's theirs, then they turn it into a religious seminary. And it's not only that they're offering money, they do so in some of the most devious ways. Recently, we had a recording emerge where a head of the organization is offering one of these Palestinian people who's considering selling a home of his, "You want a girl? 1, 2. How many do you want? How old do you want?" Trying to sweeten the pie by trying to pimp out young women to kind of say, okay, well, we'll give you this much money and we'll give you some prostitutes on the side as well. This is how low it goes. In other cases, they offer them a huge chunk of change, get them on board, convince them, all right, well, maybe I'm going to have to leave Palestine. My neighbors aren't going to be too happy about this, but with the massive amount of money I'm going to get from these Kahanists, I'll be able to buy a big swath of land somewhere else in the world. But then once they've agreed to it, the Kahanists renege. Ateret Kohanim then downgrades their offer and offers them a paltry sum, much less than they first offered. And if you don't like it, as they, again, this is quotes from the Ateret Kohanim representative saying, either you close up the place and transfer it to us, or you go to court, and it'll be a blunder. It will become clear that your father or your husband did all this for the Jews, as an agent of the Jews. There are 2 ways to do this, quietly or noisily. For you, quietly is better. And in this way, they coerce Palestinians into giving up their lands. So this is Ateret Kohanim. And Nachman, once they've got territories, as I said, they establish religious seminaries there to train young Jews in this eliminationist messianic ideology. And to staff this yeshiva, Ateret Kohanim yeshiva, he gets Shlomo Aviner, a Kahanist rabbi who's actually related to Kahane by marriage, through his son, Binyamin Kahane, through his wife. Then to be the top preacher at the yeshiva, he gets Moti Ettinger, related through Kahane's daughter, Tova, his son-in-law Moti Ettinger. So it's a completely Kahanist yeshiva through and through. And of course, young Kahanists to come study at the yeshiva and harass and harangue Palestinians as they're going about through their daily lives in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem. So, and who does he get to fund, to be the point person in the USA to make sure that that steady stream of funds keeps coming? He gets the vice president of Young Israel, Joseph Frager, also known for being the editor of a 7-volume compendium of Kahana's greatest hits. So it's a Kahanist organization top to bottom. Okay. That's Ateret Kohanim. That's Young Israel. But what about the Orthodoxy establishment? Well, New York really is the heart and soul of the Orthodox Jewish community in the Americas. And the flagship institution of higher learning for the Orthodox community is, without a doubt, an institution that's trained hundreds, thousands of rabbis over the years, talking about Yeshiva University. And the head of Yeshiva University, for many, many years, considered the greatest mind of his generation, Torah scholar by the name of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. So Soloveitchik, on the face of it, he never spoke out openly in favor of Kahana. We didn't know about his affinity for Kahana until recently when we're going through the archives of Israel's former president, the father of the current president, and peeling through the archives, we realized we found a letter from Soloveitchik to Herzog. And he says in that letter on Yeshiva University letterhead, he writes, "It is publicly known that I do not express my opinions on Israeli politics. Okay, but nevertheless, there is a bitter taste in my mouth. I cannot understand." What can't you understand? What do you have a bitter taste in your mouth over? Now it's 1984. Kahana has just been elected to Knesset, and he's demanding that the president of Israel include Kahana in the government. So all along, the head of the flagship yeshiva of the Orthodox movement was a closet Kahanist, we now know. And it wasn't only the Ashkenazi rabbis. Okay, it wasn't only the Jews whose ancestors come from Northern Europe. It was also the Jews, the Sfaradi, the Mizrahi Jews, whose ancestors come from Southern Europe and from the Middle East. So here he is preaching at a Sephardic synagogue in New York City. Fire and brimstone, of course, inciting hatred. And sitting in the corner is the chief rabbi of this community. He's listening intently, listening to Kahana drone on and on about his ideology of hate. And once he gets to the end of his presentation, the rabbi points at Kahana and he says, "What this man speaks is truth, real truth." And then he encourages the rest of the community. We need to start fundraising for this guy. We need to start giving him money so that he can put his plans into practice. It's all on video. This rabbi was not a marginal rabbi. We're talking about Abraham Hecht, the president of the Rabbinical Alliance of America. Hundreds of Orthodox rabbis made him their president. And this is the person who stood by Kahana and promoted him and fundraised for him. Okay, so up until now, I've talked about the most establishment right-wing rabbis of the Jewish community. But isn't there diversity in the Orthodox community as well? You're right, there is. So let's look at the most liberal of the Orthodox rabbis. As far left as we can go and still be called Orthodox. Talking about Avi Weiss. Rabbi Avi Weiss was so liberal. He also, of course, studied at Yeshiva University. He came from a very, very traditional place. But over the years, he, in his own synagogue, he preached a slightly different message. He encouraged women to participate in the services and to take on leadership roles in the Jewish community and in the synagogue itself. And he actually established a rabbinical school for women. Well, this is unheard of in Orthodoxy. Sure, in the more liberal streams of Judaism, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, we have female rabbis for decades already. But for the Orthodox, this is scandalous. And so this really puts Avi Weiss on the far, 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 far left of Orthodox Judaism. Okay, so surely he was reticent about Kahana's views. No. Time after time, he kept debating Kahana, sharing a platform with him, giving him an opportunity to espouse his racial hatred. But it wasn't only that they met up and dialogued and debated. He also made him come to his own synagogue. Because of my affinity for him, I invited Meir many times to speak at my synagogue. He provided the platform for Kahana to preach his hatred again and again. He spoke for almost 2 hours. The synagogue was packed. The congregation was riveted. No one moved. This is the liberal left-wing Orthodox rabbi. Even when Kahana was arrested here in the United States, in New York City, on charges that he ordered the assassination of a Russian diplomat, saying he wrote a letter to his followers in New York saying, get someone to shoot a Russian diplomat, anyone, doesn't matter who. Even after that, when Kahana went to court, Weiss, as he said in his own words, I also testified on Kahana's behalf at his trial, telling the court that Meir was not a violent man, that this man was not a violent man. The chutzpah. To give you a sense of how sick it gets. So the mid-1980s, as I said, was like a peak period for Jewish terrorism, both here in the United States and also in Israel-Palestine. And at that time, we had a Jewish terrorist group in Israel-Palestine called themselves the Jewish Underground, and they initiated a series of terrorist attacks on Palestinian targets, on innocent civilians. They bombed the vehicles of 3 Palestinian mayors. The mayor of Ramallah, he lost a leg. The mayor of Nablus, they cut off both his legs. The mayor of Al-Bira escaped, but the police officer trying to defuse the bomb went off in his face and he was horrifically burned. So they then went on and shot and bombed the Islamic College in Hebron, killing 3 students, injuring dozens. And they plotted, even if you can imagine this, again, to blow up the Dome of the Rock. Once they're arrested, what happened? Should not these people be excised from the Jewish community? Shouldn't they be condemned in the strongest terms? Not according to Rabbi Avi Weiss. According to Rabbi Avi Weiss, a terrorist wants to undermine the government. They wanted to strengthen the government, these terrorists. A terrorist shoots randomly. They were focused. They deserve our commendation, these sickening terrorists. This is Rabbi Avi Weiss, some liberal. And he should have been seen as such, an out-and-out racist. But that wasn't the case. Just a few years later, the Intifada breaks out. It's now 1990, and one of these Jewish messianic groups, Al-Aqsa destructionist groups, again, wants to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they announce that they are going to march on the Al-Aqsa Mosque and march on the Dome of the Rock, and they are going to put down a cornerstone because their plan is to demolish these mosques and these shrines and to build on their ruins a Jewish temple / abattoir where they'll slaughter 10,000 plus animals a day on Jewish holidays. So they want to destroy them, and they are going to establish the foundation stone. They're going to plant the stone and have a founding ceremony for this temple they want to build. Of course, when Palestinians learn of this, they're shocked, horrified, angered, and they all go straight to the mosque to defend it with their bodies. Israeli police mow down protesters, killing 19 of them. They're buried at the Lion's Gate, Muslim cemetery at the Lion's Gate in the Old City. After that happened, naturally, the United Nations, the least it could do is condemn this atrocity. What does Avi Weiss have to say about it? He organized a protest at his synagogue because the UN dared to condemn the Israeli government for mowing down these Palestinian protesters. He said the United Nations is anti-Israel. And it's one thing if he would have done this protest on his own, but he got American politicians in New York City to come out and stand in solidarity with him and to echo his ridiculous messaging. And one of those politicians was none other than Elizabeth Holtzman, again, District Attorney of Brooklyn, Congresswoman, City Comptroller of New York for the Democratic Party. Why would Democratic Party politicians give a second of their time, an ounce of their energy to out-and-out racists like Avi Weiss? Okay, so let's now look not at the rabbis, but at the streets. How are Israeli politics impacting on the streets of New York City? The way that the Zionist movement is celebrated most in New York City is with its annual Salute to Israel parade. Of course, it's not the only parade in New York City, but every year annually, going back now for decades, there's been a Salute to Israel parade where Zionists of all stripes march down the streets of New York City, down Fifth Avenue, with Israeli flags and signs and banners and such. Of course, they're not the only ones marching on that day. We also have anti-Zionist Jews, those few ultra-Orthodox Jews that still actually hold fast to the original ideology. They may have an eliminationist vision, but they believe that God will bring that vision and not them, and not the Zionist state. And so they oppose the Zionist state. Palestine belongs to Palestinians. So there are hecklers on the sides that show up, and of course there's also Palestinians themselves who come out and protest the Salute to Israel parade. That's not looked on too kindly, obviously, but most of the people who come out to the Salute to Israel parade are young Zionists from the secular Zionist groups and religious Zionist groups. But because the Jewish community refuses to put a limit on how far right-wing you can get, it refuses to cast out anyone in the Jewish community, no matter how racist they are, we also have Kahanists marching in the Salute to Israel parade. Kahane was right. Arab Nazis out of Israel now. And that's nowadays. Back in the day when Kahane was still alive, he himself would march down the streets. And when I say march down the streets, throngs of people. He was just greeted with absolute adulation. People pumped their fists in the air and they clapped and they were ecstatic to see Kahane, and they cheered and they chanted his name as he paraded down New York City. He had a massive community of support behind him. People would come up to him and shake his hand in the street. People would come up and embrace him and hug him. People would come and kiss his hand. And then one of the Kahanists would come around with a box, a bucket, something to collect donations, and they would start taking money from people. People would just throw money at them. That's how popular he was in New York City during his lifetime. No one stopped them from carrying around posters like this, Israel for the Jews, Arabs up your 22. I guess that's supposed to be amusing from her perspective. And this was permitted at the Salute to Israel parade. I tell you, to watch video and to hear audio of whole families marching down the streets together, chanting Jews in, Arabs out, is a very disturbing experience. So that's the parade, the Salute to Israel parade. It happens every year, and all these years it had been funded by the World Zionist Organization, it's supposed to represent all the different political factions in the Zionist movement. But once Kahane is killed in New York City, once Kahane dies in 1990, at that point, the Kahanists step up and they take over the parade, and they become the funders. And they get their money bags to put down the check in order to fund the parade, talking about Sam Dome, one of these Kahanist funders. He becomes the person to bankroll it, and to be his marshal to be the one in charge of organizing the parade, he appoints the head of Ateret Kohanim, the Kahanist Joseph Frager, who we saw before. Now Frager, what he does is, at that point, launches a new addendum to the Salute to Israel parade. If up to that point they were saluting just Israel itself, now they added a new event to coincide, that at the end of the parade there would be a massive concert in Central Park to celebrate the settlements and the settlement movement and the settlers. So now every year we also have a settler gala, concert in Central Park, and to speak at this gala event in Central Park, amongst other people, Frager invites the author or the publisher of Torat HaMelech. I don't know if anyone here has read this book or heard of this book, but we're talking about a book that is essentially a Gentile baby murdering manual. I'm sorry and sickened to say. This man, Yitzhak Ginsburg, okay, if you read what these writings say, it's right there in black and white. Straight up, he writes, there is justification for killing babies if it is clear that they will grow up to harm us. These are the kinds of insidious, sickening messages that he puts out, and he's invited to speak before Central Park, before these throngs of Zionists. And of course, he wasn't the only one invited to speak, also Benjamin Netanyahu. And so maybe some of you may be saying, wait a second, David, you were talking about the Kahane movement, now you're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu. I thought he was mainstream. I thought he was from the Likud party, the ruling Likud party. I mean, isn't that out on a limb there? Isn't that some kind of disparity here? Well, that's just it. See, after Kahane died, he couldn't get elected anymore, obviously. There was a problem. His supporters realized that they would have to bifurcate their efforts. They wouldn't be able to get the Kahanists back into power on their own. They would need to have a two-pronged strategy. On one hand, to fund the Kahane movement itself, and on the other hand, to fund Benjamin Netanyahu, a right-wing representative of the Likud party who entered the Knesset as Kahane left it, and ever since has been kind of a shadow father figure of the Kahane movement, guiding it just under the surface. So there's no contradiction. And it's not just one or two. Amongst the many people who fund and have funded both the Kahane movement and Netanyahu, and his political career, we're talking about, for example, Manfred Lehman funded both, Irving Moskowitz funded both, Simon Falek funds both, Rose Mattis. If you haven't heard of her, this is the owner of the late owner of the Haagen-Dazs empire, and of course Sam Dome himself, amongst others. So Sam Dome, it's no shocker where he's coming from. As he said, when he began funding the Salute to Israel parade, he wrote an op-ed in the local New York paper saying, "We the Jewish people are the only people in the world in need of defending our rights." This is the psychology that animates his effort. And this is a person who has Bill Clinton in his pocket. Okay, he was a major contributor not only to the Kahanists and Netanyahu, but to Bill Clinton's campaigns, if you can imagine this. An Israeli journalist who observed a meeting between the two says that Clinton hugged Dome warmly, happy to see him as if he were greeting a family member he'd not seen in a long time. Okay? And Clinton was not the only Democratic Party official to pay homage at this Kahanist parade and to Dome and his projects. At the Salute to Israel, settler concerts in New York City, Frager actually managed to get out city councilors from the Democratic Party, not one, not two. They would come out in droves, whether Sheldon Silver or David Weprin or Rory Lantzman or Anthony Weiner. They all made a beeline for the stage and took advantage of the opportunity to promote their own political agendas from the podium of this Kahanist parade. But probably the Democratic Party politician that is most responsible for the insidious Kahane infiltration of the Democratic Party is, without a doubt, Frager's partner in funding the Ateret Kohanim movement, and that is this man, Mr. Dov Heikind. A Kahanist terrorist in his own right, the head of Jewish Defense League, not only the Jewish Defense League, but one of its spin-off groups. And we're talking about a group that bombed banks, and because after the ADL listed the banks that they say didn't do business with Israel, the group that Heikind headlined went out and firebombed about a dozen of these banks in New York City. So this is the kind of terrorist that we're talking about. But he managed to parlay his popularity amongst New Yorkers into a political position, into a state assemblyman. And so when Dov Heikind enters the state legislature, you would think, because of his racist right-wing views, he would join the Republicans. First of all, talking about his Kahanist career, he didn't try to put it behind. He didn't try to leave it, in his past. He still, till this day, is proud of as he says, I'm proud of every single moment. Let me make that very clear. I never had a problem when people spoke about encouraging Palestinians to move to other parts of the Middle East, aka ethnic cleansing. Now, Kahane died in 1990, so did Heikind make a break with him at that point? No. Once Kahane died, he passed the reins over to his son, Binyamin Kahane, and Heikind was a massive supporter of Binyamin Kahane and the continuation of the Kahane movement and Kahane Chai. And so just so you don't think that perhaps the son may have been a little bit more liberal than his father, just a few choice quotes from Binyamin so you can see what Heikind supported all these years as a state assemblyman. According to Binyamin Kahane, in his own words, there are no Arabs that are innocent. They are an enemy. And with an enemy, we wage war. The law of vengeance applies to them. Vengeance is not a vague concept. Vengeance on the Gentiles. It is well established in the laws. We must kill without thinking that one of them is innocent. Wow, that's Heikind for you. Okay, so as I said, you'd think that someone as openly racist as this would not find a home in the Democratic Party, but that's exactly where he did find a home. He ran for state assembly on the Democratic ticket. This was patently ridiculous. By what basis does he have a right to run in the Democratic Party primary? I mean, if you look back at the newspaper records, you see what he took the time to speak out about. This is a time when, going back to the mid-'80s, when queer people, when gay and lesbian people are fighting for their rights. And I'm not talking about fighting for the rights to marry or fighting for the right to adopt. We're talking about fighting for the very simple right to not be fired from your job if they find out that you're gay, to not be kicked out of your own apartment if it turns out you're lesbian. Basic rights. And it wasn't just queer people, there were Jewish queer people also marching through the streets, demanding equality. But to Heikind, he was the number one opposer of this gay rights legislation that was being trying to be passed in the New York State legislature. According to Heikind, this legislation is dangerous. It presents their lifestyle as perfectly legitimate. Two men holding hands and two women holding hands. This is the nightmare scenario that he's worried about, and so he opposed the most basic anti-discrimination laws. Some civil rights leader, right? This is a Democratic Party politician. Of course, admittedly, he did see himself as a civil rights leader fighting for the rights of certain groups. The group that he was most outspoken, perhaps, or one of the groups that he was so outspoken about, was white folk, European Americans. He says that's the problem. Reverse discrimination. There is a lot of reverse discrimination that takes place in this state. Many people who happen to be white are being discriminated against. This issue is something no one has looked seriously at. He launched this whole campaign. We need to end anti-white racism, as if this is the biggest problem plaguing society. This is This is Dov Hikind, you know. But of course, you know, the number one political position that he staked out, that he used his, his political power for, was to advance the cause of Zionism, of the state of Israel. And of course, to impugn anyone who opposed anything that Israel did as an anti-Semite, as a hater of Jewish people. Now, how did he manage to make this manifest in New York City politics? Well, this is how he did it. In his own words. D'Amato won with less than 1% of the vote. Okay, we're talking about running for New York State Senate. My community was responsible for that difference. And I was involved in that race day and night. The following year, it was Giuliani. And the following year, it was Pataki, Giuliani running for Republican mayor of New York City. George Pataki running for Republican governor of New York State. All of these are Republicans. I thought he was supposed to be a Democrat. Yet he used all his political capital to funnel the vote to the Republican Party candidates. In his own words, Hikind says, I endorsed all those people. All Republicans. And what he did was he brought these politicians into the company of the most racist rabbis in New York City. How did he do it? So, for example, Abraham Hecht, who we looked at earlier, Hikind would bring Hecht, kind of create the glue to bring them into the thrall of these Republican candidates for mayor, for governor, for senator. And as he explained, the concept is a very simple one, Hikind says. A block vote. Sometimes you have to go out and convince people to vote for me. Then I have to convince your wife, then your son. But in this community, talking about ultra-Orthodox community, when I get the Rebbe, then probably I'll get the whole community. So this is what he did. He managed to parlay the votes of the community and to funnel them towards the Republican Party by leveraging the support of these racist rabbis, the most racist rabbis in New York City. Mayor after mayor, politician after politician, Hikind was the glue that made it happen. So that's New York City politics. Of course, when it comes to Israel politics, that's when Hikind really unloaded with both barrels. And as I stated earlier, in the mid-1990s, when Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin tried to, for better or for worse, we can argue about the advantages and disadvantages, but when there was an attempt, at least, to steer away from the path of apartheid and to create a two-state solution, and when Yitzhak Rabin signed a peace deal with Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn, Hikind put all his efforts into trying to sabotage this peace deal, flying back and forth, organizing massive protests in New York City, getting out his constituents to harass and harangue. Of course, he didn't do it alone. He did it with his comrade in arms, Rabbi Avi Weiss. And along with those two, they brought a third person to join to complete the triumvirate, because we had rabbis, and we had politicians, and we also had Kahanist machers, or political advisors. And the one who probably best represents that is one of Avi Weiss's constituents, one of the young people who came up in his synagogue in the Bronx. And I'm talking, in his words, probably the greatest young Jewish political activist I have encountered in the last many years. Talking about this man, Ron Tarosian. So at that time, we're talking about the mid-90s, Tarosian is allegedly the president of the Beitar movement. What is the Beitar movement? That is the youth group of the Likud party, Israel's ruling Likud party, the right-wing revisionist Zionists in Israel. They have a youth wing, and Ron Tarosian was the head of the youth wing of the Likud party. But wouldn't you know it, at the exact same time, he was also the leader of the young Kahane movement in New York City, on the down low. And we know this because he would go out to the synagogues where Kahane was praised, where Kahane preached when he was alive, and when he was praised after he was killed, and where they held his funeral ceremony, and where they held their memorial ceremonies year after year. And Ron Tarosian come out to the Young Israel of Ocean Parkway Synagogue, and of course, throngs of people would be screaming and chanting signs, Nekama, revenge, Mavet la'Arabim, death to the Arabs. And Tarosian would speak in front of the synagogue and go up to the pulpit and tell those assembled that Kahane was the greatest Jewish leader ever. The only solution is the Kahane revolution. Don't just say Rabbi Kahane was right. Don't just say the Arabs must go. Stay with us. Do something with us. And this is how the Kahane movement began its first steps towards taking over the Likud party. Remember that two-pronged effort to support the Kahanists and Benjamin Netanyahu from within the Likud party. So now they start off by taking over the youth wing of the party, the Beitar movement, the youth movement. Well, that's what Tarosian represents. So if you can get a sense of how, what kind of dirty dealings went on, so we have Tarosian launching a career now as a political advisor. New York politicians, of course, they want to check the boxes and get all those three I's, right? Italy, Ireland, and Israel. So when a Democratic Party politician is running for higher office there, Peter Vallone, he needs to go to Israel to get his bona fides, to show that he ticked that box. But he needs someone to show him the ropes, to take him around, to introduce him to people. And he decides to take the Kahanist Ron Tarosian. And so instead of visiting the places that are in the consensus of the Zionist movement, Tarosian takes Vallone down to Hebron, to the heart of the Kahane movement, to the place where Baruch Goldstein had just massacred 29 Palestinians. He said to Vallone, "There's no Arab voting bloc in New York. What's your downside? Who are you going to alienate?" Well, I can think of a few. I can think of a few New Yorkers who might be put off by him adopting the positions of the Kahane movement. But in any case, Vallone did go to Israel and the Palestinian territories and the occupied West Bank with Tarosian, went down to Hebron, and he said in his own words when he came back, "I've heard a great deal about Hebron and wanted to see it visually. Now that I'm here, it has confirmed what I already believed. There's a non-acceptance by extremists on the Arab side of how much Israel's given. I understand that these are divisive issues in the Jewish community, but it is not a divisive issue for me or the New Yorkers I know personally." And this is how the Kahane movement begins to infiltrate the Democratic Party politics. Tarosian is adopted by the Clinton family advisor, Hank Scheinkopf, and he trains him to be in political machinations. And he ends up becoming one of the most powerful PR people in New York City till this day. Out and out Kahanist, he hasn't changed his views. Straight up, he said, we should kill 100 Arabs or 1,000 Arabs for every one Jew they kill. If someone kills Jews, we should wipe out the town he's from, kill them all. These are the kinds of people advising the Democratic Party in the United States. These are the kinds of people that the Clinton family bring into their into their closest quarters. It's instructive to look at the political career of Hillary Clinton just as an example, just to give you a sense of how the Kahane movement were able to leverage these contacts into actual far-reaching accomplishments. So, as you well know, in the late 1990s, Hillary Clinton decides it's coming to the end of Bill Clinton's years as president of the United States, and she's starting to think about her own political ambitions. She decides that she's going to run for New York senator on the Democratic ticket, of course. But she's perceived as a bit of a carpetbagger because she's never lived in New York, really, right? She's from Arkansas, and then she's living in DC. So what's her connection to New York? She's seen as an outsider, and so she needs to do her homework and her legwork and show New Yorkers she's of the people. So she needs to go to all the different communities and endear herself to them. As I said, you got to tick off the 3 I's. You got to go to the Columbus Day Festival, show up with Italian Americans. You got to go to the St. Patrick's Day Parade, show up with Irish Americans, and of course with Jewish Americans, and show the, you support the Salute to Israel Parade. But at this point, she's getting some advice from senior Democratic Party lawmakers who've already gone down this road. And we have veteran Democratic Party politician Ed Koch, who was the mayor of New York City for many years, telling her, look, you're going about this wrong, Hillary. There are a lot of people in New York who are anti-Arab. It's only a minefield if you tailor your message to the group that you're courting. It's not a minefield if you have broad principles. But of course, all that just went out the window. Every possible credibility she had, forget about it. During the Clinton years, of course, she stood by her husband, and when Clinton was making an effort to bridge the gaps between Israelis and Palestinians, she made a public statement saying in favor. She said it's in the long-term interests of the Middle East for Palestine to be a state. That's not a really far-reaching comment to make, but for the Kahanists, it was beyond the pale, of course, because they want all of Israel and all of Palestine and the entire Middle East to be theirs and theirs alone. So when Hillary decides that she's going to come correct with the Kahanists, she shows up to the Salute of Israel, to the Salute to Israel parade, and of course she's heading up to that. She says, contradicting her husband's position, who, according to the Oslo Peace Accords, Jerusalem is supposed to be left for later negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, but she says now, in order to appeal to far-right Jews, that Jerusalem is Israel's eternal and indivisible capital. But that wasn't enough. You think that helped her? She came out to the streets, walking amongst the people at the Salute to Israel parade, and as she walked around, she was accosted. She's a traitor! Trying to find a friendly face in the crowd. Hillary's a Jew hater, they screamed at her. Go back to Arkansas. This is what greeted her on the streets of New York City. Things weren't looking too good. And that's even before we get to the Kahanists. Okay? Of course, the Kahanists made it a non-stop harassment and haranguement campaign. Everywhere she went in New York City and New York State, at every turn, they bombarded her. And of course, it wasn't only the Kahanists, it was the rabbis and the politicians who were in league with them, Heikind and Weiss, organizing these protests, demanding that Hillary bend to their will and prove her loyalty by adopting far-reaching positions that only the Kahanist movement had championed up to that point. Who are we talking about? What did they demand that Hillary accept? That free Pollard now. Here's a demonstration with the Kahanists and Heikind, and he's demanding that Jonathan Pollard, the Jewish American who spied against the American government on behalf of the Israeli government and received a life sentence for his espionage, that he be released. I mean, this is preposterous. At the time, people in the Jewish community were not coming out in support of Pollard. Most Jews did not want anything to do with him. They were uncomfortable with what he'd done. Did not see him as a hero in any way. But to the Kahanists, of course he's a hero. That's all that matters, Jewish power. And so the Kahanists demanded that Hillary lean on her husband and convince him to release Jonathan Pollard early. And of course, she eventually caved. And she eventually said, okay, I'll do so. And she called openly in support for the early release of Pollard. And the person that negotiated that went back and forth between her and Heikind, trying to get them onto the same page, was Hillary's campaign coordinator, Bill de Blasio. Do you think that helped Hillary? De Blasio was on board, and ever since he's been on board with Hyken's hijinks. Did that help? Of course not. Even though Hillary accepted Hyken's demands and consented and relented, he still wouldn't endorse her, of course. And so this is Dov Hyken, and this is the effect he's had on New York City politics, just to give you a taste of how it affected one person from the most powerful political dynasty in the United States on the Democratic side of the spectrum. So imagine how much it affects other people who don't have the political capital that the Clintons can claim. Bill de Blasio, same thing, he came out to all of Hyken's protests and supported him in his maximalist demands. Do you think that helped him? Do you think that meant that Hyken supported him when this Democratic Party candidate ran for New York City mayor? Same thing. He went through all the stops, made all the trips to Israel, and took all the photo ops. It still didn't help him. All his friendships with Hyken didn't amount to nothing. He still didn't get his endorsement. But this is how the Kahanists have had Democrats in their thrall for decades now. And the way to understand the worst of them is probably to look at who were the biggest proponents of the Kahanism. Now, of course, Hyken himself is probably the most famous of them. Every year he goes and honors Kahane at memorial services for Kahane and his son, his successor. But he was doing this from the very beginning, from when Kahane was first assassinated in New York City in 1990. And here at the funeral services at, as I mentioned, the Young Israel Synagogue of Ocean Parkway, at the funeral ceremony, let's look at who were the top rabbis who venerated him, who praised him, who lifted him up, who preached Kahanism from the pulpit. Were they randoms? Were they randos who you'd never hear of again and who don't have any political power? No. They are the most powerful rabbis in New York. At his funeral ceremony, from the pulpit, he said, God spoke to Kahane clearly. Time has proven his wisdom. And who was that? None other than Rabbi Moshe Tendler. Not just any old rabbi, but the dean of Yeshiva University Theological Seminary. And over the years, what's he done? Every single political development, as Israel is turned even further and further to the far right, he has been its most ardent supporter. In 2010, when hundreds of Israeli rabbis, chief rabbis, paid by my tax money, big salaries, chief rabbis of Israeli cities all around the country sign an edict, a religious edict, saying that Jews are not permitted to sell or even rent properties to non-Jews, to Palestinians or other non-Jews. Look, that's straight racism, and it's obvious to anyone who hears it. And so at this point, American rabbis across the board expunge this idea and criticize it harshly. But Tendler stood up and spoke in support of this rabbi's letter, saying, it's part of a concern, and I believe a rightful one. There's a war going on, and we're trying our best to maintain normalcy by refusing to sell or even rent apartments to non-Jews. Preaching this from the streets of New York City, the most multicultural city in the world, the most cosmopolitan city in the world. Until Tendler stepped to the mic, Orthodox Jews weren't supporting the Aqsa destructionist movement. Across the board, every Orthodox rabbi worth his salt would tell you, Jews are not supposed to go up to Haram al-Sharif. That is only for a messianic era. We are in an impure state. It is a Muslim shrine. It's going to stay that way until God comes down and decides otherwise. Until then, Jews don't go up. But not Tendler. Tendler was the first rabbi who actively spoke out in support of the Al-Aqsa destructionist movement, the Jewish Templar movement, the modern Jewish Templars who want to take over the site, demolish the mosques, and turn it into a Jewish temple / abattoir. Tendler took a tour of the site, and with the leader of the destructionist movement, Israel Ariel. And since that time, because he was the first person to step out and support, others joined in his wake. And now we have a massive movement. Now it's actually become a mass movement. Now there's still not a majority, but scarily and sickeningly, this has become a more mainstream movement in Israeli society. And it's thanks to people like Tendler. And Tendler wasn't beyond the pale. That's the crazy part. He wasn't someone that you wouldn't want anything to do with. He had the Democratic Party by the balls. Kenneth Gribbetz, again, Brooklyn DA, or Rockland County DA, New York area DA, Metropolitan New York area District Attorney. According to New York Magazine, going back to the 1970s, that Tendler was Gribbetz's mentor. He was his secret weapon. He was the guardian of his political fortune. And he delivered the votes for Gribbetz. As Heikind explained, because his community voted as he chose and as he instructed them, he funneled the votes to Gribbetz, and Gribbetz did his bidding, the most racist rabbi in New York City. Now, it wasn't only Tendler, okay, in the first few years, the funeral took place at Young Israel of Ocean Parkway, and the first few memorial ceremonies took place at that synagogue as well. But who was the rabbi of that synagogue? Tendler was the guest speaker. The chief rabbi of that synagogue was Rabbi Herbert Bomzer. Again, not a marginal figure, not someone no one wants anything to do with. We're talking about someone who was, again, not low on the totem pole, but the dean of Yeshiva University, the flagship educational institution of Orthodox Judaism in America. And this dean of Yeshiva University hosted Kahane when he was alive, allowed him to speak to his students at the yeshiva, at the synagogue, held memorial services, and Herbert Bomzer held in his thrall Charles Hines, Brooklyn DA from the Democratic Party. All these are Democratic Party politicians. And how did that manifest? What was the results of Bomzer's stranglehold on Democratic Party politics? Sickeningly, it meant that according to the New York Times, who reported on it, it made it harder to curb sexual abuse because these rabbis would create a smokescreen and allow these men who had committed horrific crimes against children in the community and children outside the community and who were charged with horrific crimes to escape to Israel so they wouldn't face any retribution. And when it came to pass, and a man that Herbert Bomzer had hired to teach children was charged with the rape, and experts say the number of children he raped ranged between 100 and 400 kids. But what did Bomzer have to say? He said, if he has managed to get to Israel and he is protected by the law there, then leave it alone. This is what he used his political power for. This is what the Democratic Party in New York City is responsible for. This is the legacy of the Kahane movement in New York. Now, Herbert Bomzer got old. He's since died. He passed on to his assistant, to his next in line, to the person with whom he led the Va'ad Rabbanim of Flatbush. And from then on, from the late 1990s into the 2000s, we have every year the Kahane memorial services now shifting venues to this synagogue just down the street, walking distance, also in that same area of Brooklyn, New York, called the Pri Etz Chaim Synagogue. Would you believe it? Chuck Schumer found this synagogue so pivotal that he actually brought the American House of Representatives committee to have a meeting at this synagogue. It's the only time in American history that any synagogue, or perhaps any house of worship even, but certainly any Jewish house of worship, was hosting a meeting, an official meeting of an American congressional delegation of a House of Representatives committee. hosted it in this synagogue that provided a platform year after year after year for Kahanist ideology and Kahanist supporters to preach their hatred. From the bima, from the pulpit, they preached Kahanism every year in, year out. Rabbi Melvinberg was the rabbi there. And when he stood up at the Kahane memorials, he said that Kahane stood for what was correct. We should have agreed with them. And talking to the followers of Kahane who had organized that memorial in his synagogue, he said, it's not the congregation allowing you to come here. You are allowing us to do something. You are doing a favor to us by allowing us to honor this ultra-racist Meir Kahane. Now, Berg, for his efforts, for his dedication to the Kahane movement and his racist ideology, the Kahane movement decided to honor him and to grant him an award. So he's now an award-winning rabbi. The award he won was the Rabbi Kahane Memorial Fund Award of Courage and Integrity. Wow, well, that should have put him in a category beyond the pale. But not for the Democratic Party of New York, who felt that he also deserved to receive an award from the Democratic Party for being the leader of an important community, and so they wanted to honor him. So the Democratic Party, the local Democratic Party officials actually granted him an award, this sickening preacher who supported Kahane in every which way as long as he was alive, and created a platform where his followers could incite genocide. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let's look at what was said besides the rabbi himself, what Kahane's followers said from that podium once he stepped off the stage. Of course, we had that sickening successor to Kahane, the Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who published the King's Torah, calling for the murder of non-Jewish babies. But we also had the head of the publishing company, Ginsburg Publishing Company, that published these sickening texts, talking about Shmuel Sackett, another New York-born Jew who followed Kahane to Israel. And when he took the podium at Pri Etz Chaim Synagogue, he told those assembled, I am a student of Rabbi Meir Kahane. I was, I am, I always will be, and proud of it. My children are being trained in the way of our teacher and rabbi. And then he's instructing them, what does that mean? Well, what is Kahanism? Let there be no mistakes. I'll break it down for you. In your business and in your personal life, don't hire any Arabs whatsoever. Not to paint your house, not to fix your toilet, not to fix your electricity, not to be a worker or a mover. If you really love Jews, then you drive out the Arabs. And that's not it. It doesn't end there. For those who are counting there. No, after we drive out the Arabs, we drive out the Armenians. And we drive out the Christians. Make no mistake, they are absolutely serious when they say they want to ethnically cleanse the country by force. They are not joking. The leadership of the nation can come only from the students of Rabbi Kahane, and then they put their plan into practice. I talked about how Ron Tarosian began the infiltration of the youth of the Likud party, the Beitar movement, and now we have the infiltration into the Likud party itself. Going back 2 decades, he explains the plan. If any one of us cared to listen, all we needed to do was show up to these memorial services. They explained the whole, all their machinations, everything they intended to do. They just laid it all out. Sackett explained, I started a group in Israel called Manigut Yehudit, which means Jewish leadership. And this was a faction, a Kahanist faction within the Likud party. Started 20 years ago. We formed a bloc inside Likud, Israel's ruling party. We're attempting to take over the Likud party and turn it into a Torah party. We had a sweeping victory last week. We are now the largest independent bloc in all of Likud. And this wasn't only words. This wasn't only a plan that never came to fruition. He made it happen. he and the other Kahanists that he put in power. And he managed to actually get one of these Kahanists not only into the Knesset, but as the deputy speaker of the Knesset. Talking about Moshe Feiglin, if you're familiar. Of course, now that the Kahane movement is re-mainstreamed, there's no need to hide anymore. So now he shows up to the modern-day memorials for Kahane in Israel, in Jerusalem, and he openly admits, I was a Kahanist all along. You didn't know about it, but for the last 20 years, from day one, I've been a Kahanist. You know, I just infiltrated the Likud party, so I couldn't be open about it, but now I'm putting all my cards on the table. And now that they're re-mainstreamed, you have the leader of the Kahanist party entering the Knesset. If Netanyahu comes back, he'll be a minister. But now that he's mainstreamed, he's A-OK by the Republican Party. Here is former Vice President Pence coming to Khalil, to Hebron, the site of the massacre, the worst mass murder in Israeli history. Coming to the site of the murder and getting a tour of the area and of these holy sites from none other than the Kahanists themselves. Meeting with Ben-Gvir, shaking his hand and praising him and wishing him well and wishing that he'll succeed. And the man standing beside them who brought Pence to this point, you may recognize him because he's also an American citizen. This is Simon Falek, one of those moneybags billionaires that funded both the Kahanists and Netanyahu all these years. Made his billions and still does from the Duty Free Americas, a corporation that he owns. When you go to the airport and you see that store, that's where your money's going, to fund the Kahane movement. But not only the Kahane movement, because he wanted to make sure that the Kahane movement would get support on this side of the Atlantic. And so every time something happens, some atrocity, some vile act that the Israeli government commits, we quickly have a phallic-sponsored politician to stand up and defend it, to speak out in Israel's defense, like Elliot Engel. Every time there's a destruction, an obliteration of entire neighborhoods in Gaza, we have a phallic-sponsored politician like Debbie Wasserman to stand in solidarity with Benjamin Netanyahu. Every time we have horrific destructions of communities in the Nakab, demolishing of Palestinian villages, we have a phallic-sponsored politician from the Democratic Party like Ted Deutsch to quickly come to Israel's side. And every time we have violent attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank by Jewish hooligans, we have Democratic Party politicians funded by the phallics like Robert Menendez to stand in solidarity and accuse anyone who says otherwise of being an anti-Semitic Jew hater. And so now we've got to the point where Israel can pass any racist law it wants, including the most recent nation-state law that openly and explicitly, no longer the mask drops and it's openly apartheid, will have a phallic-funded Democratic politician like Juan Vargas to say that for Israel to take in Lebanon, parts of Syria, Jordan, and some portions of Egypt, I've got absolutely no objection. This is where we are today. We've come to the point where the mask has fallen. There's no need anymore to hide the synergy between the Democrats and the Kahanists. So we have Shlomo Mustovsky, the president for over a decade of Young Israel Synagogues, the Kahanist synagogue movement. He becomes a Supreme Court judge in New York on the basis of Democratic Party votes. That's the past. There's no need anymore. Now that it's out in the open, the next generation just openly admits what it's all about. His first son, Nachman, cavorts with the plotters of the January 6th insurrection. And his next son actually was one of the insurrectionists who was charged and jailed for his participation. So this is where we are now today. This is what we've come to. These are the final slides to take you out. The first chief rabbi of Palestine 100 years ago, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, he had to explain Zionism to his followers because, as I said, it wasn't natural for Orthodox Jews to cooperate with secular Jews at a nation-building project, and he needed to synthesize those. So in order to make it palatable to Orthodox Jews, he said, think of it this way. You know how in our tradition we say that the Messiah will come on a donkey? Well, we are the Messiah. And that donkey is the secular Zionists. They will do the labor. They will build the land. They will kick out the Arabs. They will do all the statecraft. And then once all the hard work is done, we will ride in on their backs and take over the leadership. And this is where we are today, not only in Israel, but also here in the United States. Except the donkey that they're riding in on is the democratic donkey. And that's why I say that they are the false Messiah's donkey, controlled by the Kahanists. That's it for today.